Hello everyone, welcome to your first learning module in EDCI 595. This first learning module is all focused on differentiation. Differentiation is kind of the foundation for quality curriculum and instruction for gifted students. That being said, I don't want you to think that differentiation is only for gifted students. So actually, using differentiated teaching is simply a best practice. So it's not just a way to teach gifted students, it's a way to teach all of your students more effectively. So first off, let's just look at the word differentiation. I'll write it down here. Within the word differentiation, here we are, we see a very obvious word, and that would be different. Okay, so basically what differentiation means is you are doing different things in the classroom to meet your students' strengths as well as their needs. Okay, now there's another word that we often hear that has a very negative connotation, and that is tracking. Okay, tracking is kind of like, if you think back several years in education, we used to have like the red group for reading, and the yellow group and the green group, or the bluebirds and the blackbirds. And tracking basically said that depending upon how ready the students are, we're going to place them in one of three tracks. Okay. Differentiation is nothing like tracking. So tracking actually is not good practice at all. If you think about a railroad track, which I'm sure you guys will hear in the background as I'm teaching, I live very close to the light rail in Charlotte. So I'm just drawing 3 railroad tracks right here. Okay, so with tracking, it's not as if this train can hop over here, right? So once I start on this train, I'm on that track for good, right? So you can't just simply move over. So this track, let's say this is A, B, or C, it's preset and it's just going one way. So if I have a student who's on the A track, that means they're stuck on that A track, and the A track is already built, right? So I have exactly a plan of where that student is going. Well, the problem is, what happens as that child is growing and has increased knowledge and different interests and different preferences in terms of how they learn? That produces a really big problem because tracking makes students really stuck, and it also leads to those students defining themselves based on which track they are on. The difference with differentiation is always changing. Okay, so don't think of differentiation as different tracks. Think of differentiation as various methods that you can cross paths over and over again, right? So if you think about like a mountain, trying to get to the top of the mountain, when you're hiking, you can choose to go on this path, or maybe you feel adventurous, so you're going to go down and visit the river first, and then you're going to come up here. But then maybe you could cross back over there, right? So there's not a set track for learning. What differentiation is about is providing different tracks, and the students, based on their strengths and their needs, are able to adapt based on how they are. Okay, so first things first, tracking keeps the student stuck. Tracking, it's predetermining where that student is going, and that's very ineffective in the classroom. Differentiation, I'm providing multiple avenues, multiple methods, and at times multiple different end products, but students are not stuck in one method. So the beautiful thing with differentiation is at times one student will be, quote, an expert about something, but the next day they may not be, and that's because we're human, right? And we have different interests. Okay, so let's keep thinking through differentiation. First, I want you to consider your student. One thing I always tell my students in our face-to-face classes is your students are not just brains walking around, right? There is more to them than just a brain. What often happens to our gifted students is they're just considered as a brain. So oftentimes when we talk about differentiation, most people will think about how academically ready are they in terms of knowledge. Unfortunately, some people will equate that to how smart are they. But from 594, we know that gifted is not smart. It's definitely not our definition, correct? So one thing I want you to do is be careful in your terminology. So the first thing in terms of how can these students differ is their academic readiness. Okay, so basically all this means is how ready are they about one certain topic. So they could be very ready in mathematics, but not as ready in English. Okay, so oftentimes that's all we think about in terms of how can the students differ. However, they're not just brains. So you also need to remember that your students have all different kinds of interests. Okay, so that's your second thing to consider in terms of the students, your readiness and then your interest. So it could be interests related to the topic. It could also be interests that are not obviously related to the topic, but it's very easy to use student interest as you're teaching. A great example of that, I have a high school teacher who's one of my colleagues, and a couple of years ago he taught U.S. history, and he taught that through the lens of how cars changed in our societies, because his students were really interested in cars that year. And so they started to look at, well, what vehicles were the individuals driving during this war, and what vehicles were they driving during the Great Depression, and they put context to the material they were studying based on their interests. So you have readiness, interest, and our last thing is their learner preference. Now notice I did not say their learning style. We'll get to that in a minute. But your learning preference is, how do you prefer to learn? So quite simply, think about your library content. I give you both videos, handouts, readings, and lectures. Chances are some of you prefer to start with the lectures, some of you prefer to start with the readings, okay? That in and of itself is showing that I'm considering various learning preferences. Now be careful about labeling that as a learning style. When we say the word learning style, it's kind of like putting students on tracks again. We're saying, oh, you're an auditory learner, you're only learning on that auditory track. Where really what's most effective is if we provide multiple avenues. So your students are going to differ. You've got readiness, interest, and learner profile. And now, or preference rather, let's talk about in the classroom, what can you as the instructor change? So things that you can do differently. The first is you can change the final product, okay? So the final product is simply how will the students demonstrate their knowledge. This could be writing a final paper. This could be doing a group project with a presentation at the end. It could also be taking a traditional test. So that's your final product. But I also want you to notice that those products could be more and less advanced. So one of the ways that I often see students, or teachers rather, differentiating in the classroom or think they're differentiating in the classroom is through product. So what happens is students get done early, so then they give more product. So they just keep adding more and more. All right, so I've got my little plus signs. But in doing that, they're just requiring the student to create more of the same product. So you finish 20 math problems, now you have to do 20 more of the same thing. Whereas if we were really differentiating for product, all of the students would get 20 math problems, but some of your students who are more academically ready in those specific types of math problems, all they would need to do is 20 problems that were more advanced. Okay, so it's not more, it's different. So focus on that different piece. We can also differentiate for process. Okay, so we can differentiate for product, process, and then we'll talk about the last one in a moment. So your process is, how are the students learning? Okay, some of them might have that preference for learning independently. Others may have that preference for learning collaboratively. Now, you can also vary your process in terms of difficulty. Say, for example, you are doing a unit on a research paper. You can scaffold the research process at varying different levels for your students depending upon their academic readiness. So it may be that some of your students are just beginning to learn what that analysis portion looks like. So you could provide 5 research articles that they are required to analyze into the research paper. Now, what if some of your students are more academically ready though? In that case, they are working toward the same product this time of a research paper, but perhaps you do not provide any articles for them. So they are engaging in a different and more challenging process. Okay, so don't think that differentiating means that every student has their end product. You can also very easily change up the process. And the last thing that we can differentiate for is content itself. Okay, so we can differentiate on product, process, and content. So content in the sense of challenging some students with more difficult material. Oftentimes we will do what we call curriculum compacting, where students are either learning material at a faster rate, or oftentimes they're just skipping some material that they already know, so the content is different. Okay? Now, there are various different strategies and methods to achieve differentiation, right? In fact, in my own personal experience, I kind of just do a little bit of everything. And the most important thing, in my opinion, to do in terms of differentiation is first think of your student. So it doesn't have to be individual because, yes, real world, guys, we've got 25 kids in this class, right? But you will know them, right? For my practicing teachers, you know that. You can generally know their interest and their learning preference and their readiness. Now, no, you don't just have that in your mind. We gain this information by pre-assessment. And we'll talk about that in our next learning module, because the first step to really good differentiation is figuring this out about our student. Okay, so I'm a very visual person. So I want you to think of readiness, interest, and learning preference for your students. Look at these cute little stick figure guys, right? So this is about your student. How ready academically is the student? What are the student's interests? And what is the student's learning preference? Okay? Now, for you, your role, this one page is getting pretty full here. All right, so I just drew the teacher a little bit bigger to emphasize. The teacher is in charge of changing up the product, the process, and the content. Okay? So our first step is to figure out what are the students' readiness, interest, and learning preference, and then how do we meet that by changing product, process, and content. So that is your brief overview of differentiation. The key here, guys, is that word different. So we're constantly changing things up. We're not saying you're on A, B, or C track. We're saying depending upon this student's readiness, interest, and learning preference, I'm going to change my product, process, and content in my teaching.